Chapter 6. At full steam. At this shout the entire crew rushed toward the harpooner commander, officers, mates, sailors, cabin boys, down to engineers leaving their machinery and stokers neglecting their furnaces. The order was given to stop, and the frigate merely coasted. By then the darkness was profound, and as good as the Canadian's eyes were, I still wondered how he could see in what he had seen. My heart was pounding fit to burst. But Ned Land was not mistaken, and we all spotted the object his hand was indicating. 2 cable lengths off the Abraham Lincoln's starboard quarter, the sea seemed to be lit up from underneath. This was no mere phosphorescent phenomenon, that much was unmistakable. Submerged some fathoms below the surface of the water, the monster gave off that very intense but inexplicable glow that several captains had mentioned in their reports. This magnificent radiance had to come from some force with a great illuminating capacity. The edge of its light swept over the sea in an immense, highly elongated oval, condensing at the center into a blazing core whose unbearable glow diminished by degrees outward. "It's only a cluster of phosphorescent particles," exclaimed one of the officers. "No, sir," I answered with conviction. "Not even angel-wing clams or salps have ever given off such a powerful light. That glow is basically electric in nature. Besides, look, it's shifting, it's moving back and forth. It's darting at us." A universal shout went up from the frigate. "Quiet," Commander Farragut said. "Helm hard to leeward, reverse engines." Sailors rushed to the helm, engineers to their machinery. Under reverse steam immediately, the Abraham Lincoln beat to port, sweeping in a semicircle. "Right your helm, engines forward," Commander Farragut called. These orders were executed, and the frigate swiftly retreated from this core of light. My mistake. It wanted to retreat, but the unearthly animal came at us with a speed double our own. We gasped. More stunned than afraid, we stood mute and motionless. The animal caught up with us, played with us. It made a full circle around the frigate, then doing 14 knots and wrapped us in sheets of electricity that were like luminous dust. Then it retreated 2 or 3 miles, leaving a phosphorescent trail comparable to those swirls of steam that shoot behind the locomotive of an express train. Suddenly, all the way from the dark horizon where it had gone to gather momentum, the monster abruptly dashed toward the Abraham Lincoln with frightening speed, stopped sharply 20 feet from our side plates, and died out not by diving under the water, since its glow did not recede gradually but all at once, as if the source of this brilliant emanation had suddenly dried up. Then it reappeared on the other side of the ship, either by circling around us or by gliding under our hull. At any instant a collision could have occurred that would have been fatal to us. Meanwhile I was astonished at the frigate's maneuvers. It was fleeing, not fighting. Built to pursue, it was being pursued, and I commented on this to Commander Farragut. His face, ordinarily so emotionless, was stamped with indescribable astonishment. "Professor Aronnax," he answered me, "I don't know what kind of fearsome creature I'm up against, and I don't want my frigate running foolish risks in all this darkness. Besides, how should we attack this unknown creature? How should we defend ourselves against it? Let's wait for daylight and then we'll play a different role. You've no further doubts, Commander, as to the nature of this animal?" "No, sir. It's apparently a gigantic narwhal, and an electric one to boot." "Maybe," I added, "it's no more approachable than an electric eel or an electric ray." "Right," the commander replied. "And if it has their power to electrocute, it's surely the most dreadful animal ever conceived by our Creator. That's why I'll keep on my guard, sir." The whole crew stayed on their feet all night long. No one even thought of sleeping. Unable to compete with the monster's speed, the Abraham Lincoln slowed down and stayed at half steam. For its part, the narwhal mimicked the frigate, simply rode with the waves, and seemed determined not to forsake the field of battle. However, near midnight it disappeared, or to use a more appropriate expression, it went out, like a huge glowworm. Had it fled from us, we were duty-bound to fear so rather than hope so. But at 12:53 in the morning, a deafening hiss became audible, resembling the sound made by a waterspout expelled with tremendous intensity. By then Commander Farragut, Ned Land, and I were on the afterdeck, peering eagerly into the profound gloom. "Ned Land," the commander asked, "you've often heard whales bellowing." "Often, sir, but never a whale like this, whose sighting earned me $2,000. "Correct, the prize is rightfully yours." "But tell me, isn't that the noise cetaceans make when they spurt water from their blowholes?" "The very noise, sir, but this one's way louder, so there can be no mistake. There's definitely a whale lurking in our waters." "With your permission, sir," the harpooner added, "tomorrow at daybreak we'll have words with it." "If it's in a mood to listen to you, Mr. Land," I replied in a tone far from convinced. "Let me get within 4 harpoon lengths of it," the Canadian shot back, "and it had better listen. But to get near it," the commander went on, "I'd have to put a whaleboat at your disposal." "Certainly, sir." "That would be gambling with the lives of my men." "And with my own," the harpooner replied simply. Near 2 o'clock in the morning the core of light reappeared, no less intense, 5 miles to windward of the Abraham Lincoln. Despite the distance, despite the noise of wind and sea, we could distinctly hear the fearsome thrashings of the animal's tail and even its panting breath. Seemingly, the moment this enormous narwhal came up to breathe at the surface of the ocean, air was sucked into its lungs like steam into the huge cylinders of a 2,000-horsepower engine. I said to myself. "A cetacean as powerful as a whole cavalry regiment now, that's a whale of a whale." We stayed on the alert until daylight, getting ready for action. Whaling gear was set up along the railings. Our chief officer loaded the blunderbusses, which can launch harpoons as far as a mile, and long duck guns with exploding bullets that can mortally wound even the most powerful animals. Ned Land was content to sharpen his harpoon, a dreadful weapon in his hands. At 6 o'clock day began to break, and with the dawn's early light, the narwhal's electric glow disappeared. At 7 o'clock the day was well along, but a very dense morning mist shrank the horizon, and our best spyglasses were unable to pierce it. The outcome: disappointment and anger. I hoisted myself up to the crosstrees of the mizzen sail. Some officers were already perched on the mastheads. At 8 o'clock the mist rolled ponderously over the waves, and its huge curls were lifting little by little. The horizon grew wider and clearer all at once. Suddenly, just as on the previous evening, Ned Land's voice was audible. "There's the thing in question, astern to port," the harpooner shouted. Every eye looked toward the point indicated. There, a mile and a half from the frigate, a long blackish body emerged a meter above the waves. Quivering violently, its tail was creating a considerable eddy. Never had caudal equipment thrashed the sea with such power. An immense wake of glowing whiteness marked the animal's track, sweeping in a long curve. Our frigate drew nearer to the cetacean. I examined it with a completely open mind. Those reports from the Shannon and the Helvetia had slightly exaggerated its dimensions, and I put its length at only 250 feet. Its girth was more difficult to judge, but all in all, the animal seemed to be wonderfully proportioned in all 3 dimensions. While I was observing this phenomenal creature, 2 jets of steam and water sprang from its blowholes and rose to an altitude of 40 meters, which settled for me its mode of breathing. From this I finally concluded that it belonged to the branch Vertebrata, class Mammalia, subclass Monodelphia, group Pisciforma, order Cetacea family. But here I couldn't make up my mind. The order Cetacea consists of 3 families: baleen whales, sperm whales, dolphins, and it's in this last group that narwhals are placed. Each of these families is divided into several genera, each genus into species, each species into varieties. So I was still missing variety, species, genus, and family, but no doubt I would complete my classifying with the aid of Heaven and Commander Farragut. The crew were waiting impatiently for orders from their leader. The latter, after carefully observing the animal, called for his engineer. The engineer raced over. "Sir," the commander said, "are you up to pressure?" "Aye, sir," the engineer replied. "Fine, stoke your furnaces and clap on full steam." 3 cheers greeted this order. The hour of battle had sounded. A few moments later, the frigate's 2 funnels vomited torrents of black smoke, and its deck quaked from the trembling of its boilers. Driven forward by its powerful propeller, the Abraham Lincoln headed straight for the animal. Unconcerned, the latter let us come within half a cable length. Then, not bothering to dive, it got up a little speed, retreated, and was content to keep its distance. This chase dragged on for about 3/4 of an hour without the frigate gaining 2 fathoms on the cetacean. At this rate, it was obvious that we would never catch up with it. Infuriated, Commander Farragut kept twisting the thick tuft of hair that flourished below his chin. "Ned Land," he called. The Canadian reported at once. "Well, Mr. Land," the commander asked, "do you still advise putting my longboats to sea?" "No, sir," Ned Land replied, "because that beast won't be caught against its will." "Then what should we do?" "Stoke up more steam, sir, if you can." "As for me, with your permission I'll go perch on the bobstays under the bowsprit, and if we can get within a harpoon length I'll harpoon the brute." "Go to it, Ned," Commander Farragut replied. "Engineer," he called, "keep the pressure mounting." Ned Land made his way to his post. The furnaces were urged into greater activity. Our propeller did 43 revolutions per minute, and steam shot from the valves. Heaving the log, we verified that the Abraham Lincoln was going at the rate of 18.5 miles per hour. But that damned animal also did a speed of 18.5. For the next hour our frigate kept up this pace without gaining a fathom. This was humiliating for one of the fastest racers in the American Navy. The crew were working up into a blind rage. Sailor after sailor heaved insults at the monster which couldn't be bothered with answering back. Commander Farragut was no longer content simply to twist his goatee, he chewed on it. The engineer was summoned once again. "You're up to maximum pressure?" the commander asked him. "Aye, sir," the engineer replied. "And your valves are charged to 6.5 atmospheres. Charge them to 10 atmospheres, a typical American order if I ever heard one. It would have sounded just fine during some Mississippi paddle-wheeler race to outstrip the competition." "Conseil," I said to my gallant servant now at my side, "you realize that we'll probably blow ourselves sky-high." "As master wishes," Conseil replied. "All right, I admit it. I did wish to run this risk." The valves were charged. More coal was swallowed by the furnaces. Ventilators shot torrents of air over the braziers. The Abraham Lincoln's speed increased. Its masts trembled down to their blocks, and swirls of smoke could barely squeeze through the narrow funnels. We heaved the log a second time. "Well, helmsman," Commander Farragut asked. 19.3 miles per hour, sir. Keep stoking the furnaces." The engineer did so. The pressure gauge marked 10 atmospheres, but no doubt the cetacean itself had warmed up, because without the least trouble it also did 19.3. What a chase! No, I can't describe the excitement that shook my very being. Ned Land stayed at his post, harpoon in hand. Several times the animal let us approach. "We're overhauling it," the Canadian would shout. Then, just as he was about to strike, the cetacean would steal off with a swiftness I could estimate at no less than 30 miles per hour. And even at our maximum speed, it took the liberty of thumbing its nose at the frigate by running a full circle around us. A howl of fury burst from every throat. By noon we were no farther along than at 8 o'clock in the morning. Commander Farragut then decided to use more direct methods. "Bah," he said. "So that animal is faster than the Abraham Lincoln. All right, we'll see if it can outrun our conical shells. Mate, man the gun and the bow." Our forecastle cannon was immediately loaded and leveled. The cannoneer fired a shot, but his shell passed some feet above the cetacean, which stayed half a mile off. "Over to somebody with better aim," the commander shouted. "And $500 to the man who can pierce that infernal beast." Calm of eye, cool of feature, an old gray-bearded gunner, I can see him to this day, approached the cannon, put it in position, and took aim for a good while. There was a mighty explosion, mingled with cheers from the crew. The shell reached its target. It hit the animal, but not in the usual fashion. It bounced off that rounded surface and vanished into the sea 2 miles out. "Oh, drat," said the old gunner in his anger. "That rascal must be covered with 6-inch armor plate." "Curse the beast," Commander Farragut shouted. The hunt was on again, and Commander Farragut leaned over to me, saying, "I'll chase that animal till my frigate explodes." "Yes," I replied, "and nobody would blame you." We could still hope that the animal would tire out and not be as insensitive to exhaustion as our steam engines. But no such luck. Hour after hour went by without it showing the least sign of weariness. However, to the Abraham Lincoln's credit, it must be said that we struggled on with tireless persistence. I estimate that we covered a distance of at least 500 kilometers during this ill-fated day of November 6, but night fell and wrapped the surging ocean in its shadows. By then I thought our expedition had come to an end, that we would never see this fantastic animal again. I was mistaken. At 10:50 in the evening, that electric light reappeared 3 miles to windward of the frigate, just as clear and intense as the night before. The narwhal seemed motionless. Was it asleep perhaps, weary from its workday, just riding with the waves? This was our chance, and Commander Farragut was determined to take full advantage of it. He gave his orders. The Abraham Lincoln stayed at half steam, advancing cautiously so as not to awaken its adversary. In midocean, it's not unusual to encounter whales so sound asleep they can successfully be attacked, and Ned Land had harpooned more than one in its slumber. The Canadian went to resume his post on the bobstays under the bowsprit. The frigate approached without making a sound, stopped 2 cable lengths from the animal and coasted. Not a soul breathed on board. A profound silence reigned over the deck. We were not 100 feet from the blazing core of light, whose glow grew stronger and dazzled the eyes. Just then, leaning over the forecastle railing, I saw Ned Land below me, one hand grasping the martingale, the other brandishing his dreadful harpoon. Barely 20 feet separated him from the motionless animal. All at once his arm shot forward and the harpoon was launched. I heard the weapon collide resonantly, as if it had hit some hard substance. The electric light suddenly went out, and 2 enormous waterspouts crashed onto the deck of the frigate, racing like a torrent from stem to stern, toppling crewmen, breaking spare masts and yardarms from their lashings. A hideous collision occurred, and thrown over the rail with no time to catch hold of it, I was hurled into the sea. Chapter 7. A whale of unknown species. Although I was startled by this unexpected descent, I at least have a very clear recollection of my sensations during it. At first I was dragged about 20 feet under. I'm a good swimmer, without claiming to equal such other authors as Byron and Edgar Allan Poe, who were master divers, and I didn't lose my head on the way down. With 2 vigorous kicks of the heel, I came back to the surface of the sea. My first concern was to look for the frigate. Had the crew seen me go overboard? Was the Abraham Lincoln tacking about? Would Commander Farragut put a longboat to sea? Could I hope to be rescued? The gloom was profound. I glimpsed a black mass disappearing eastward where its running lights were fading out in the distance. It was the frigate. I felt I was done for. "Help, help!" I shouted, swimming desperately toward the Abraham Lincoln. My clothes were weighing me down. The water glued them to my body. They were paralyzing my movements. I was sinking. I was suffocating. "Help!" This was the last shout I gave. My mouth was filling with water. I struggled against being dragged into the depths. Suddenly my clothes were seized by energetic hands. I felt myself pulled abruptly back to the surface of the sea, and yes, I heard these words pronounced in my ear. "If Master would oblige me by leaning on my shoulder, Master will swim with much greater ease." With one hand I seized the arm of my loyal Conseil. "You," I said. "You, myself," Conseil replied, "and at Master's command. That collision threw you overboard along with me. Not at all, but being in Master's employ, I followed Master. The fine lad thought this only natural. What about the frigate?" I asked. "The frigate," Conseil replied, rolling over on his back. "I think Master had best not depend on it to any great extent." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that just as I jumped overboard, I heard the men at the helm shout, 'Our propeller and rudder are smashed.'" "Smashed?" "Yes, smashed by the monster's tusk. I believe it's the sole injury the Abraham Lincoln has sustained. But most inconveniently for us, the ship can no longer steer." "Then we're done for." "Perhaps," Conseil replied serenely. "However, we still have a few hours before us, and in a few hours one can do a great many things." Conseil's unflappable composure cheered me up. I swam more vigorously, but hampered by clothes that were as restricting as a cloak made of lead, I was managing with only the greatest difficulty. Conseil noticed as much. "Master will allow me to make an incision," he said, and he slipped an open clasp knife under my clothes, slitting them from top to bottom with one swift stroke. Then he briskly undressed me while I swam for us both. I then did Conseil the same favor, and we continued to navigate side by side. But our circumstances were no less dreadful. Perhaps they hadn't seen us go overboard, and even if they had, the frigate being undone by its rudder couldn't return to leeward after us, so we could count only on its longboats. Conseil had coolly reasoned out this hypothesis and laid his plans accordingly. An amazing character, this boy. In mid-ocean, this stoic lad seemed right at home. So having concluded that our sole chance for salvation lay in being picked up by the Abraham Lincoln's longboats, we had to take steps to wait for them as long as possible. Consequently, I decided to divide our energies so we wouldn't both be worn out at the same time, and this was the arrangement. While one of us lay on his back, staying motionless with arms crossed and legs outstretched, the other would swim and propel his partner forward. This towing role was to last no longer than 10 minutes, and by relieving each other in this way, we could stay afloat for hours, perhaps even until daybreak. Slim chance, but hope springs eternal in the human breast. Besides, there were two of us. Lastly, I can vouch as improbable as it seems that even if I had wanted to destroy all my illusions, even if I had been willing to give in to despair, I could not have done so. The cetacean had rammed our frigate at about 11 o'clock in the evening. I therefore calculated on 8 hours of swimming until sunrise, a strenuous task but feasible thanks to our relieving each other. The sea was pretty smooth and barely tired us. Sometimes I tried to peer through the dense gloom, which was broken only by the phosphorescent flickers coming from our movements. I stared at the luminous ripples breaking over my hands, shimmering sheets spattered with blotches of bluish gray. It seemed as if we'd plunged into a pool of quicksilver. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, I was overcome with tremendous exhaustion. My limbs stiffened in the grip of intense cramps. Conseil had to keep me going, and attending to our self-preservation became his sole responsibility. I soon heard the poor lad gasping. His breathing became shallow and quick. I didn't think he could stand such exertions for much longer. Go on, I told him. "Leave master behind," he replied. "Never. I'll drown before he does." Just then, past the fringes of a large cloud that the wind was driving eastward, the moon appeared. The surface of the sea glistened under its rays. That kindly light rekindled our strength. I held up my head again. My eyes darted to every point of the horizon. I spotted the frigate. It was 5 miles from us and formed no more than a dark, barely perceptible mass. But as for longboats, not a one in sight. I tried to call out. What was the use at such a distance? My swollen lips wouldn't let a single sound through. Conseil could still articulate a few words, and I heard him repeat at intervals, "Help! Help!" Ceasing all movement for an instant, we listened. And it may have been a ringing in my ear from this organ filling with impeded blood, but it seemed to me that Conseil's shout had received an answer back. "Did you hear that?" I muttered. "Yes, yes." And Conseil hurled another desperate plea into space. This time there could be no mistake. A human voice had answered us. Was it the voice of some poor devil left behind in mid-ocean, some other victim of that collision suffered by our ship, or was it one of the frigate's longboats hailing us out of the gloom? Conseil made one final effort, embracing his hands on my shoulders while I offered resistance with one supreme exertion. He raised himself half out of the water, then fell back exhausted. "What did you see?" "I saw," he muttered. "I saw, but we mustn't talk. Save our strength." What had he seen? Then, Lord knows why, the thought of the monster came into my head for the first time. But even so, that voice. Gone are the days when Jonahs took refuge in the bellies of whales. Nevertheless, Conseil kept towing me. Sometimes he looked up, stared straight ahead, and shouted a request for directions, which was answered by a voice that was getting closer and closer. I could barely hear it. I was at the end of my strength. My fingers gave out. My hands were no help to me. My mouth opened convulsively, filling with brine. Its coldness ran through me. I raised my head one last time, then I collapsed. Just then something hard banged against me. I clung to it. Then I felt myself being pulled upward, back to the surface of the water. My chest caved in and I fainted. For certain I came to quickly because someone was massaging me so vigorously it left furrows in my flesh. I half opened my eyes. "Conseil," I muttered. "Did Master ring for me?" Conseil replied. Just then, in the last light of a moon settling on the horizon, I spotted a face that wasn't Conseil's but which I recognized at once. "Ned," I exclaimed. "In person, sir, and still after his prize," the Canadian replied. "You were thrown overboard after the frigate's collision." "Yes, Professor, but I was luckier than you, and right away I was able to set foot on this floating islet. Or in other words, on our gigantic narwhal. Explain yourself, Ned. It's just that I soon realized why my harpoon got blunted and couldn't puncture its hide." "Why, Ned, why?" "Because, Professor, this beast is made of boilerplate steel." At this point in my story, I need to get a grip on myself, reconstruct exactly what I experienced, and make doubly sure of everything I write. The Canadian's last words caused a sudden upheaval in my brain. I swiftly hoisted myself to the summit of this half-submerged creature or object that was serving as our refuge. I tested it with my foot. Obviously it was some hard, impenetrable substance, not the soft matter that makes up the bodies of our big marine mammals. But this hard substance could have been a bony carapace, like those that covered some prehistoric animals, and I might have left it at that and classified this monster among such amphibious reptiles as turtles or alligators. Well, no. The blackish back supporting me was smooth and polished with no overlapping scales. On impact, it gave off a metallic sonority, and as incredible as this sounds, it seemed, I swear, to be made of riveted plates. No doubts were possible. This animal, this monster, this natural phenomenon that had puzzled the whole scientific world, that had muddled and misled the minds of seamen in both hemispheres, was, there could be no escaping it, an even more astonishing phenomenon, a phenomenon made by the hand of man. Even if I had discovered that some fabulous, mythological creature really existed, it wouldn't have given me such a terrific mental jolt. It's easy enough to accept that prodigious things can come from our Creator. But to find all at once, right before your eyes, that the impossible had been mysteriously achieved by man himself, this staggers the mind. But there was no question now. We were stretched out on the back of some kind of underwater boat that, as far as I could judge, boasted the shape of an immense steel fish. Ned Land had clear views on the issue. Conseil and I could only line up behind him. "But then," I said, "does this contraption contain some sort of locomotive mechanism and a crew to run it?" "Apparently," the harpooner replied. "And yet for the 3 hours I've lived on this floating island, it hasn't shown a sign of life. This boat hasn't moved at all." "No, Professor Aronnax, it just rides with the waves, but otherwise it hasn't stirred. But we know that it's certainly gifted with great speed." "Now then, since an engine is needed to generate that speed, and a mechanic to run that engine, I conclude we're saved." "Humph," Ned Land put in, his tone denoting reservations. Just then, as if to take my side in the argument, a bubbling began astern of this strange submersible whose drive mechanism was obviously a propeller, and the boat started to move. We barely had time to hang on to its topside, which emerged about 80 centimeters above water. Fortunately, its speed was not excessive. "So long as it navigates horizontally," Ned Land muttered, "I've no complaints, but if it gets the urge to dive, I wouldn't give $2 for my hide." The Canadian might have quoted a much lower price. So it was imperative to make contact with whatever beings were confined inside the plating of this machine. I searched its surface for an opening or a hatch, a manhole, to use the official term, but the lines of rivets had been firmly driven into the sheet iron joins and were straight and uniform. Moreover, the moon then disappeared and left us in profound darkness. We had to wait for daylight to find some way of getting inside this underwater boat. So our salvation lay totally in the hands of the mysterious helmsman steering this submersible, and if it made a dive, we were done for. But aside from this occurring, I didn't doubt the possibility of our making contact with them. In fact, if they didn't produce their own air, they inevitably had to make periodic visits to the surface of the ocean to replenish their oxygen supply. Hence the need for some opening that put the boat's interior in contact with the atmosphere. As for any hope of being rescued by Commander Farragut, that had to be renounced completely. We were being swept westward, and I estimate that our comparatively moderate speed reached 12 miles per hour. The propeller churned the waves with mathematical regularity, sometimes emerging above the surface and throwing phosphorescent spray to great heights. Near 4 o'clock in the morning, the submersible picked up speed. We could barely cope with this dizzying rush, and the waves battered us at close range. Fortunately, Ned's hands came across a big mooring ring fastened to the topside of this sheet iron back, and we all held on for dear life. Finally, this long night was over. My imperfect memories won't let me recall my every impression of it. A single detail comes back to me. Several times, during various lulls of wind and sea, I thought I heard indistinct sounds, a sort of elusive harmony produced by distant musical chords. What was the secret behind this underwater navigating, whose explanation the whole world had sought in vain? What beings lived inside this strange boat? What mechanical force allowed it to move about with such prodigious speed? Daylight appeared. The morning mists surrounded us, but they soon broke up. I was about to proceed with a careful examination of the hull, whose topside formed a sort of horizontal platform, when I felt it sinking little by little. "Oh, damnation!" Ned Land shouted, stamping his foot on the resonant sheet iron. "Open up there, you antisocial navigators." But it was difficult to make yourself heard above the deafening beats of the propeller. Fortunately, this submerging movement stopped. From inside the boat, there suddenly came noises of iron fastenings pushed roughly aside. One of the steel plates flew up, a man appeared, gave a bizarre yell, and instantly disappeared. A few moments later, 8 strapping fellows appeared silently, their faces like masks, and dragged us down into their fearsome machine. Chapter 8. Mobiles in Mobile. This brutally executed capture was carried out with lightning speed. My companions and I had no time to collect ourselves. I don't know how they felt about being shoved inside this aquatic prison, but as for me, I was shivering all over. With whom were we dealing? Surely with some new breed of pirates, exploiting the sea after their own fashion. The narrow hatch had barely closed over me when I was surrounded by profound darkness. Saturated with the outside light, my eyes couldn't make out a thing. I felt my naked feet clinging to the steps of an iron ladder. Forcibly seized, Ned Land and Conseil were behind me. At the foot of the ladder, a door opened and instantly closed behind us with a loud clang. We were alone. Where? I couldn't say, could barely even imagine. All was darkness, but such utter darkness that after several minutes, my eyes were still unable to catch a single one of those hazy gleams that drift through even the blackest nights. Meanwhile, furious at these goings-on, Ned Land gave free rein to his indignation. "Damnation!" he exclaimed. "These people are about as hospitable as the savages of New Caledonia. All that's lacking is for them to be cannibals. I wouldn't be surprised if they were, but believe you me, they won't eat me without my kicking up a protest." "Calm yourself, Ned, my friend," Conseil replied serenely. "Don't flare up so quickly. We aren't in a kettle yet." "In a kettle, no," the Canadian shot back, "but in an oven for sure. It's dark enough for one. Luckily, my bowie knife hasn't left me, and I can still see well enough to put it to use. The first one of these bandits who lays a hand on me, author's note. A bowie knife is a wide-bladed dagger that Americans are forever carrying around." "Don't be so irritable, Ned," I then told the harpooner, "and don't ruin things for us with pointless violence. Who knows whether they might be listening to us? Instead, let's try to find out where we are." I started moving, groping my way. After 5 steps, I encountered an iron wall made of riveted boilerplate. Then, turning around, I bumped into a wooden table next to which several stools had been set. The floor of this prison lay hidden beneath thick, hempen matting that deadened the sound of footsteps. Its naked walls didn't reveal any trace of a door or window. Going around the opposite way, Conseil met up with me, and we returned to the middle of this cabin, which had to be 20 feet long by 10 wide. As for its height, not even Ned Land, with his great stature, was able to determine it. Half an hour had already gone by without our situation changing, when our eyes were suddenly spirited from utter darkness into blinding light. Our prison lit up all at once. In other words, it filled with luminescent matter so intense that at first I couldn't stand the brightness of it. From its glare and whiteness, I recognized the electric glow that had played around this underwater boat like some magnificent phosphorescent phenomenon. After involuntarily closing my eyes, I reopened them and saw that this luminous force came from a frosted half-globe curving out of the cabin ceiling. "Finally, it's light enough to see," Ned Land exclaimed, knife in hand, staying on the defensive. "Yes," I replied, then ventured the opposite view. "But as for our situation, we're still in the dark." "Master must learn patience," said the emotionless Conseil. This sudden illumination of our cabin enabled me to examine its tiniest details. It contained only a table and 5 stools. Its invisible door must have been hermetically sealed. Not a sound reached our ears. Everything seemed dead inside this boat. Was it in motion, or stationary on the surface of the ocean, or sinking into the depths? I couldn't tell. But this luminous globe hadn't been turned on without good reason. Consequently, I hoped that some crewman would soon make an appearance. If you want to consign people to oblivion, you don't light up their dungeons. I was not mistaken. Unlocking noises became audible, a door opened, and 2 men appeared. One was short and stocky, powerfully muscled, broad-shouldered, robust of limbs, the head squat, the hair black and luxuriant, the mustache heavy, the eyes bright and penetrating, and his whole personality stamped with that southern-blooded zest that, in France, typifies the people of Provence. The philosopher Diderot has very aptly claimed that a man's bearing is the clue to his character, and this stocky little man was certainly a living proof of this claim. You could sense that his everyday conversation must have been packed with such vivid figures of speech as personification, symbolism, and misplaced modifiers. But I was never in a position to verify this because, around me, he used only an odd and utterly incomprehensible dialect. The second stranger deserves a more detailed description. A disciple of such character-judging anatomists as Gratiolet or Engel could have read this man's features like an open book. Without hesitation, I identified his dominant quality's self-confidence, since his head reared like a nobleman's above the arc formed by the lines of his shoulders, and his black eyes gazed with icy assurance. Calmness, since his skin, pale rather than ruddy, indicated tranquility of blood. Energy, shown by the swiftly knitting muscles of his brow. And finally courage, since his deep breathing denoted tremendous reserves of vitality. I might add that this was a man of great pride, that his calm, firm gaze seemed to reflect thinking on an elevated plane, and that the harmony of his facial expressions and bodily movements resulted in an overall effect of unquestionable candor, according to the findings of physiognomists, those analysts of facial character. I felt involuntarily reassured in his presence, and this boded well for our interview. Whether this individual was 35 or 50 years of age, I could not precisely state. He was tall, his forehead broad, his nose straight, his mouth clearly etched, his teeth magnificent, his hands refined, tapered, and to use a word from palmistry, highly psychic, in other words, worthy of serving a lofty and passionate spirit. This man was certainly the most wonderful physical specimen I had ever encountered. One unusual detail: his eyes were spaced a little far from each other and could instantly take in nearly a quarter of the horizon. This ability, as I later verified, was strengthened by a range of vision even greater than Ned Land's. When this stranger focused his gaze on an object, his eyebrow lines gathered into a frown, his heavy eyelids closed around his pupils to contract his huge field of vision, and he looked. What a look! As if he could magnify objects shrinking into the distance, as if he could probe your very soul, as if he could pierce those sheets of water so opaque to our eyes and scan the deepest seas. wearing caps made of sea otter fur and shod in sealskin fishing boots. These two strangers were dressed in clothing made from some unique fabric that flattered the figure and allowed great freedom of movement. The taller of the two, apparently, the leader on board, examined us with the greatest care, but without pronouncing a word. Then, turning to his companion, he conversed with him in a language I didn't recognize. It was a sonorous, harmonious, flexible dialect whose vowels seemed to undergo a highly varied accentuation. The other replied with a shake of the head and added 2 or 3 utterly incomprehensible words. Then he seemed to question me directly with a long stare. I replied in clear French that I wasn't familiar with his language, but he didn't seem to understand me, and the situation grew rather baffling. "Still, Master should tell our story," Conseil said to me. "Perhaps these gentlemen will grasp a few words of it." I tried again, telling the tale of our adventures, clearly articulating my every syllable and not leaving out a single detail. I stated our names and titles. Then in order I introduced Professor Aronnax, his manservant Conseil, and Mr. Ned Land, harpooner. The man with calm, gentle eyes listened to me serenely, even courteously, and paid remarkable attention. But nothing in his facial expression indicated that he understood my story. When I finished, he didn't pronounce a single word. One resource still left was to speak English. Perhaps they would be familiar with this nearly universal language. But I only knew it, as I did the German language, well enough to read it fluently, not well enough to speak it correctly. Here, however, our overriding need was to make ourselves understood. "Come on, it's your turn," I told the harpooner. "Over to you, Mr. Land. Pull out of your bag of tricks the best English ever spoken by an Anglo-Saxon, and try for a more favorable result than mine." Ned needed no persuading and started our story all over again, most of which I could follow. Its content was the same, but the form differed. Carried away by his volatile temperament, the Canadian put great animation into it. He complained vehemently about being imprisoned in defiance of his civil rights, asked by virtue of which law he was hereby detained, invoked writs of habeas corpus, threatened to press charges against anyone holding him in illegal custody, ranted, gesticulated, shouted, and finally conveyed by an expressive gesture that we were dying of hunger. This was perfectly true, but we had nearly forgotten the fact. Much to his amazement, the harpooner seemed no more intelligible than I had been. Our visitors didn't bat an eye. Apparently they were engineers who understood the languages of neither the French physicist Arago nor the English physicist Faraday. Thoroughly baffled after vainly exhausting our philological resources, I no longer knew what tactic to pursue when Conseil told me, "If Master will authorize me, I'll tell the whole business in German." "What? You know German?" I exclaimed. "Like most Flemish people, with all due respect to Master." "On the contrary, my respect is due you. Go to it, my boy." And Conseil, in his serene voice, described for the third time the various vicissitudes of our story. But despite our narrator's fine accent and stylish turns of phrase, the German language met with no success. Finally, as a last resort, I hauled out everything I could remember from my early school days, and I tried to narrate our adventures in Latin. Cicero would have plugged his ears and sent me to the scullery, but somehow I managed to pull through, with the same negative result. This last attempt ultimately misfiring, the two strangers exchanged a few words in their incomprehensible language and withdrew, not even favoring us with one of those encouraging gestures that are used in every country in the world. The door closed again. "This is outrageous," Ned Land shouted, exploding for the 20th time. "I ask you. We speak French, English, German, and Latin to these rogues, and neither of them has the decency to even answer back." "Calm down, Ned," I told the seething harpooner. "Anger won't get us anywhere." "But Professor," our irascible companion went on, "can't you see that we could die of hunger in this iron cage?" "Bah," Conseil put in philosophically. "We can hold out a good while yet." "My friends," I said, "we mustn't despair. We've gotten out of tighter spots. So please do me the favor of waiting a bit before you form your views on the commander and crew of this boat." "My views are fully formed," Ned Land shot back. "They're rogues." "Oh, good. And from what country?" "Roguedom. My gallant Ned, as yet that country isn't clearly marked on maps of the world, but I admit that the nationality of these two strangers is hard to make out. Neither English, French, nor German, that's all we can say. But I'm tempted to think that the commander and his chief officer were born in the low latitudes. There must be southern blood in them. But as to whether they're Spaniards, Turks, Arabs, or East Indians, their physical characteristics don't give me enough to go on. And as for their speech, it's utterly incomprehensible." "That's the nuisance in not knowing every language," Conseil replied, "or the drawback in not having one universal language." "Which would all go out the window," Ned Land replied. "You see, these people have a language all to themselves, a language they've invented just to cause despair in decent people who ask for a little dinner. Why, in every country on earth, when you open your mouth, snap your jaws, smack your lips and teeth, isn't that the world's most understandable message? From Quebec to the Tuamotu Islands, from Paris to the Antipodes, doesn't it mean, 'I'm hungry, give me a bite to eat'?" "Oh," Conseil put in, "there are some people so unintelligent by nature." As he was saying these words, the door opened. A steward entered. He brought us some clothes, jackets and sailor's pants made out of a fabric whose nature I didn't recognize. I hurried to change into them, and my companions followed suit. Author's note: a steward is a waiter on board a steamer. Meanwhile our silent steward, perhaps a deaf mute, set the table and laid 3 place settings. "There's something serious afoot," Conseil said, "and it bodes well." "Bah," replied the rancorous harpooner. "What the devil do you suppose they eat around here? Turtle livers, loin of shark, dogfish steaks." "We'll soon find out," Conseil said. Overlaid with silver dish covers, various platters had been neatly positioned on the table cloth, and we sat down to eat. Assuredly, we were dealing with civilized people, and if it hadn't been for this electric light flooding over us, I would have thought we were in the dining room of the Hotel Adelphi in Liverpool or the Grand Hotel in Paris. However, I feel compelled to mention that bread and wine were totally absent. The water was fresh and clear, but it was still water, which wasn't what Ned Land had in mind. Among the foods we were served, I was able to identify various daintily dressed fish, but I couldn't make up my mind about certain otherwise excellent dishes, and I couldn't even tell whether their contents belonged to the vegetable or the animal kingdom. As for the tableware, it was elegant and in perfect taste. Each utensil, spoon, fork, knife, and plate, bore on its reverse a letter encircled by a Latin motto, and here is its exact duplicate: mobilis in mobili, and moving within the moving element. It was a highly appropriate motto for this underwater machine, so long as the preposition in is translated as within and not upon. The letter N was no doubt the initial of the name of that mystifying individual in command beneath the seas. Ned and Conseil had no time for such musings. They were wolfing down their food, and without further ado I did the same. By now, I felt reassured about our fate, and it seemed obvious that our hosts didn't intend to let us die of starvation. But all earthly things come to an end, all things must pass, even the hunger of people who haven't eaten for 15 hours. Our appetites appeased, we felt an urgent need for sleep, a natural reaction after that interminable night of fighting for our lives. "Ye gods, I'll sleep soundly," Conseil said. "Me, I'm out like a light," Ned Land replied. My 2 companions lay down on the cabin's carpeting and were soon deep in slumber. As for me, I gave in less readily to this intense need for sleep. Too many thoughts had piled up in my mind, too many insoluble questions had arisen, too many images were keeping my eyelids open. Where were we? What strange power was carrying us along? I felt, or at least I thought I did, the submersible sinking toward the sea's lower strata. Intense nightmares besieged me. In these mysterious marine sanctuaries, I envisioned hosts of unknown animals, and this underwater boat seemed to be a blood relation of theirs, living, breathing, just as fearsome. Then my mind grew calmer, my imagination melted into hazy drowsiness, and I soon fell into an uneasy slumber. Chapter 9. The Tantrums of Ned Land. I have no idea how long this slumber lasted, but it must have been a good while, since we were completely over our exhaustion. I was the first one to wake up. My companions weren't yet stirring and still lay in their corners like inanimate objects. I had barely gotten up from my passably hard mattress when I felt my mind clear, my brain go on the alert. So I began a careful re-examination of our cell. Nothing had changed in its interior arrangements. The prison was still a prison and its prisoners still prisoners. But taking advantage of our slumber, the steward had cleared the table. Consequently, nothing indicated any forthcoming improvement in our situation, and I seriously wondered if we were doomed to spend the rest of our lives in this cage. This prospect seemed increasingly painful to me because, even though my brain was clear of its obsessions from the night before, I was feeling an odd short-windedness in my chest. It was becoming hard for me to breathe. The heavy air was no longer sufficient for the full play of my lungs. Although our cell was large, we obviously had used up most of the oxygen it contained. In essence, over an hour's time, a single human being consumes all the oxygen found in 100 liters of air, at which point that air has become charged with a nearly equal amount of carbon dioxide and is no longer fit for breathing. So it was now urgent to renew the air in our prison, and no doubt the air in this whole underwater boat as well. Here a question popped into my head. How did the commander of this aquatic residence go about it? Did he obtain air using chemical methods, releasing the oxygen contained in potassium chlorate by heating it, meanwhile absorbing the carbon dioxide with potassium hydroxide? If so, he would have to keep up some kind of relationship with the shore to come by the materials needed for such an operation. Did he simply limit himself to storing the air in high-pressure tanks and then dispense it according to his crew's needs? Perhaps. Or, proceeding in a more convenient, more economical, and consequently more probable fashion, was he satisfied with merely returning to breathe at the surface of the water like a cetacean, renewing his oxygen supply every 24 hours? In any event, whatever his method was, it seemed prudent to me that he use this method without delay. In fact, I had already resorted to speeding up my inhalations in order to extract from the cell what little oxygen it contained, when suddenly I was refreshed by a current of clean air, scented with a salty aroma. It had to be a sea breeze, life-giving and charged with iodine. I opened my mouth wide, and my lungs glutted themselves on the fresh particles. At the same time, I felt a swaying, a rolling of moderate magnitude but definitely noticeable. This boat, this sheet-iron monster, had obviously just risen to the surface of the ocean, there to breathe in good whale fashion. So the ship's mode of ventilation was finally established. When I had absorbed a chestful of this clean air, I looked for the conduit, the air carrier, if you prefer, that allowed this beneficial influx to reach us, and I soon found it. Above the door opened an air vent that let in a fresh current of oxygen, renewing the thin air in our cell. I had got to this point in my observations when Ned and Conseil woke up almost simultaneously, under the influence of this reviving air purification. They rubbed their eyes, stretched their arms, and sprang to their feet. "Did Master sleep well?" Conseil asked me with his perennial good manners. "Extremely well, my gallant lad," I replied. "And how about you, Mr. Ned Land?" "Like a log, Professor. But I must be imagining things because it seems like I'm breathing a sea breeze." A seaman couldn't be wrong on this topic, and I told the Canadian what had gone on while he slept. "Good," he said. "That explains perfectly all that bellowing we heard when our so-called narwhal lay in sight of the Abraham Lincoln. Perfectly, Mr. Land. It was catching its breath. Only I've no idea what time it is, Professor Aronnax, unless maybe it's dinner time." "Dinner time, my fine harpooner." "I'd say at least breakfast time, because we've certainly woken up to a new day." "Which indicates," Conseil replied, "that we've spent 24 hours in slumber." "That's my assessment," I replied. "I won't argue with you," Ned Land answered. "But dinner or breakfast, that steward will be plenty welcome whether he brings the one or the other." "The one and the other," Conseil said. "Well put," the Canadian replied. "We deserve 2 meals, and speaking for myself, I'll do justice to them both. "All right, Ned, let's wait and see," I replied. "It's clear that these strangers don't intend to let us die of hunger, otherwise last evening's dinner wouldn't make any sense." "Unless they're fattening us up," Ned shot back. "I object," I replied. "We have not fallen into the hands of cannibals." "Just because they don't make a habit of it," the Canadian replied in all seriousness, "doesn't mean they don't indulge from time to time. Who knows? Maybe these people have gone without fresh meat for a long while, and in that case 3 healthy, well-built specimens like the professor, his manservant, and me. Get rid of those ideas, Mr. Land," I answered the harpooner. "And above all, don't let them lead you to flare up against our hosts, which would only make our situation worse." "Anyhow," the harpooner said, "I'm as hungry as all Hades, and dinner or breakfast, not one puny meal has arrived." "Mr. Land," I answered, "we have to adapt to the schedule on board, and I imagine our stomachs are running ahead of the chief cook's dinner bell." "Well then, we'll adjust our stomachs to the chef's timetable," Conseil replied serenely. "There you go again, Conseil, my friend," the impatient Canadian shot back. "You never allow yourself any displays of bile or attacks of nerves. You're everlastingly calm. You'd say your after-meal grace even if you didn't get any food for your before-meal blessing, and you'd starve to death rather than complain." "What good would it do?" Conseil asked. "Complaining doesn't have to do good, it just feels good." "And if these pirates, I say pirates out of consideration for the professor's feelings, since he doesn't want us to call them cannibals, if these pirates think they're going to smother me in this cage without hearing what cuss words spice up my outbursts, they've got another think coming. Look here, Professor Aronnax, speak frankly. How long do you figure they'll keep us in this iron box? To tell the truth, friend Land, I know little more about it than you do. But in a nutshell, what do you suppose is going on? My supposition is that sheer chance has made us privy to an important secret. Now then, if the crew of this underwater boat have a personal interest in keeping that secret, and if their personal interest is more important than the lives of 3 men, I believe that our very existence is in jeopardy. If such is not the case, then at the first available opportunity, this monster that has swallowed us will return us to the world inhabited by our own kind. Unless they recruit us to serve on the crew," Conseil said, "and keep us here, till the moment," Ned Land answered, "when some frigate that's faster or smarter than the Abraham Lincoln captures this den of buccaneers, then hangs all of us by the neck from the tip of a mainmast yardarm." "Well thought out, Mr. Land," I replied. "But as yet, I don't believe we've been tendered any enlistment offers. Consequently, it's pointless to argue about what tactics we should pursue in such a case. I repeat, let's wait, let's be guided by events, and let's do nothing, since right now there's nothing we can do." "On the contrary, Professor," the harpooner replied, not wanting to give in, "there is something we can do." "Oh, and what, Mr. Land? Break out of here." "Breaking out of a prison on shore is difficult enough, but with an underwater prison it strikes me as completely unworkable." "Come now, Ned, my friend," Conseil asked, "how would you answer Master's objection?" I refuse to believe that an American is at the end of his tether. Visibly baffled, the harpooner said nothing. Under the conditions in which fate had left us, it was absolutely impossible to escape. But a Canadian's wit is half French, and Mr. Ned Land made this clear in his reply. "So, Professor Aronnax," he went on after thinking for a few moments, "you haven't figured out what people do when they can't escape from their prison." "No, my friend. Easy, they fix things so they stay there." "Of course," Conseil put in. "Since we're deep in the ocean, being inside this boat is vastly preferable to being above it or below it. But we fix things by kicking out all the jailers, guards, and wardens," Ned Land added. "What's this, Ned?" I asked. "You'd seriously consider taking over this craft?" "Very seriously," the Canadian replied. "It's impossible." "And why is that, sir?" "Some promising opportunity might come up, and I don't see what could stop us from taking advantage of it. If there are only about 20 men on board this machine, I don't think they can stave off 2 Frenchmen and a Canadian." It seemed wiser to accept the harpooner's proposition than to debate it. Accordingly, I was content to reply, "Let such circumstances come, Mr. Land, and we'll see. But until then, I beg you to control your impatience. We need to act shrewdly, and your flare-ups won't give rise to any promising opportunities. So swear to me that you'll accept our situation without throwing a tantrum over it." "I give you my word, Professor," Ned Land replied in an unenthusiastic tone. "No vehement phrases will leave my mouth, no vicious gestures will give my feelings away, not even when they don't feed us on time." "I have your word, Ned," I answered the Canadian. Then our conversation petered out, and each of us withdrew into his own thoughts. For my part, despite the harpooner's confident talk, I admit that I entertained no illusions. I had no faith in those promising opportunities that Ned Land mentioned. To operate with such efficiency, this underwater boat had to have a sizable crew, so if it came to a physical contest, we would be facing an overwhelming opponent. Besides, before we could do anything, we had to be free, and that we definitely were not. I didn't see any way out of this sheet iron, hermetically sealed cell. And if the strange commander of this boat did have a secret to keep, which seemed rather likely, he would never give us freedom of movement aboard his vessel. Now then, would he resort to violence in order to be rid of us, or would he drop us off one day on some remote coast? There lay the unknown. All these hypotheses seemed extremely plausible to me, and to hope for freedom through use of force, you had to be a harpooner. I realized, moreover, that Ned Land's brooding was getting him madder by the minute. Little by little, I heard those aforesaid cuss words welling up in the depths of his gullet, and I saw his movements turn threatening again. He stood up, pacing in circles like a wild beast in a cage, striking the walls with his foot and fist. Meanwhile the hours passed, our hunger nagged unmercifully, and this time the steward did not appear, which amounted to forgetting our castaway status for much too long if they really had good intentions toward us. Tortured by the growling of his well-built stomach, Ned Land was getting more and more riled, and despite his word of honor, I was in real dread of an explosion when he stood in the presence of one of the men on board. For 2 more hours Ned Land's rage increased. The Canadian shouted and pleaded, but to no avail. The sheet iron walls were deaf. I didn't hear a single sound inside this dead-seeming boat. The vessel hadn't stirred, because I obviously would have felt its hull vibrating under the influence of the propeller. It had undoubtedly sunk into the watery deep and no longer belonged to the outside world. All this dismal silence was terrifying. As for our neglect, our isolation in the depths of this cell, I was afraid to guess at how long it might last. Little by little, hopes I had entertained after our interview with the ship's commander were fading away. The gentleness of the man's gaze, the generosity expressed in his facial features, the nobility of his bearing, all vanished from my memory. I saw this mystifying individual anew for what he inevitably must be, cruel and merciless. I viewed him as outside humanity, beyond all feelings of compassion, the implacable foe of his fellow man, toward whom he must have sworn an undying hate. But even so, was the man going to let us die of starvation, locked up in this cramped prison, exposed to those horrible temptations to which people are driven by extreme hunger? This grim possibility took on a dreadful intensity in my mind, and fired by my imagination, I felt an unreasoning terror run through me. Conseil stayed calm. Ned Land bellowed. Just then a noise was audible outside. Footsteps rang on the metal tiling. The locks were turned, the door opened, the steward appeared. Before I could make a single movement to prevent him, the Canadian rushed at the poor man, threw him down, held him by the throat. The steward was choking in the grip of those powerful hands. Conseil was already trying to loosen the harpooner's hands from his half-suffocated victim, and I had gone to join in the rescue, when I was abruptly nailed to the spot by these words pronounced in French. "Calm down, Mr. Land. And you, Professor, kindly listen to me.